Well, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. I am a federal judge, and after listening to our last presentation, I want to assure you that there are some federal judges that want to encourage you to go out and do your research and to examine the files of the Kennedy assassination and come back with your own conclusions. I'm sure that some of my colleagues don't agree with that, but that certainly is my message. I'm going to spend just a few minutes on the details of the work of the review board, just to familiarize some of you who perhaps don't know. I know a lot of you are aware of the work of the board and followed the board very closely, and I might add that from the standpoint of the review board and its staff, we all appreciated that very much because we got a lot of important leads, a lot of important information, a lot of important advice from people who were in the assassination research community, and we appreciated that a great deal. It helped our work immeasurably. I am convinced, and I will probably say this more than once today, that the very tragic assassination of President Kennedy was really compounded by excessive secrecy. And unfortunately, there were far too many government people through the years who tried to tell you the answers and then hide the materials. In other words, trust us. This is what happened. You have to trust us. We can't show you the material. With the review board, we tried very hard to be a very different kind of government organization, one that shared all the materials with you and didn't try to tell you what happened. And I hope that we've succeeded in that. It surely was the intention of the board not to prejudge anything, but to look everywhere where records of this very tragic event and its investigatory aftermath might be. The President John F. Kennedy Records Collection Act of 1992 is the federal law which created this process. Its most important centerpiece was that it put control of declassification of secret government records in the hands of an independent body for the first time ever. Structurally, we were set up as an independent agency in the executive branch of government with a part-time board. The records, any record related to the assassination, carried a presumption that it was to be released. An overriding presumption. Those of you who are in the legal community know that when a presumption attaches, it's much more difficult for opponents to that presumption to overcome it. We had the authority as a review board, a 5-member part-time review board, to postpone the release of information if the agency of government persuaded us by clear and convincing evidence. Now, that's a very high standard to meet, much higher than would be the standard in any civil case, for example. We could postpone the information if the agency persuaded us by clear and convincing evidence that the harm of the disclosure would outweigh the public interest in the information. Now, you start with a given that the public interest in anything concerning the Kennedy assassination is very, very high. So in other words, the harm represented by disclosure had to be extraordinarily high to outweigh the public interest. So as you can see, this was quite an extraordinary statute in terms of its tilt toward opening the records. And obviously there was a reason for that. People were clamoring to get after this material after so many years. And we could postpone information if the harm outweighed the public interest only in select categories. One was a general national security category. One was a category which involved intelligence gathering operations. A third was personal privacy. That wasn't used very often. And the fourth was presidential security, which means methods of protecting the president, and I don't believe we used that category at all. No information was protected under that category. Once we had made our decision, the agency had a right to appeal that decision, not into court where it would have lasted for years, but an appeal directly to the President of the United States. So that made it also quite extraordinary. An agency had to decide, do I want to expend political capital going to the President to try to get a decision overturned on a few words contained in a document? So that really is the structure of the board. The board members, the five of us, were not chosen because of any special knowledge. We were chosen, I think, because it was hoped that we could be fair and independent, and I mean fair to all sides. I tried to take the position throughout my work on the review board that I didn't know what the answer was, because I thought that if I thought I knew the answer, then I would stop looking for other answers, and I thought it was important to be completely open-minded. Even the most fantastic or perhaps even outrageous theory, if it was presented to us, we followed up. We hunted for information. And again, let me thank those in the assassination research community, and that's what we refer to all of you who spend time, devote time in your lives to researching the open issues of the assassination. The leads were very, very important, and I think we drew a special amount of assistance from you. But what we engaged in for the 4 years was not a reinvestigation of the assassination. I didn't think anyone needed that at this point in time. It wasn't likely to change. I don't think the 75 or 80% who believed there was a conspiracy anyway. But we felt, as Congress did, that the public had a right to see all these materials. So what we conducted was an investigation, but it was an investigation that constituted a no-holds-barred search for the record, public and private. We found, when we began, and the best way to describe this is a giant jigsaw puzzle that had a lot of pieces missing. And so we set off on the hunt for the pieces to try to complete that puzzle. In the end, the puzzle surely is not complete, it's far from it, but I think we found some of those pieces that may help all of you in your own research. We had a staff of about 30 people. It was an excellent staff, particularly in the early years. One of the staff members, Tom Samalek, who was for quite a while our deputy director, is here today, and he was a very vital part of this investigation and a great help to the board. We held over 90 meetings of the 5-member board. Many of the meetings had to be in private because of the fact that we were considering confidential information. But we held regular public hearings. Some of you attended our hearings. We had 7 public hearings that we held in various parts of the country where we actually invited members of the public to come in and testify. And I've met some of you over the last several days who testified at our hearings. We had hearings in Washington, in Dallas, in New Orleans, in Boston, and in Los Angeles. We tried to get around the country as much as we could because people have information from a lot of different sources. We worked with 27 agencies of the federal government that possessed assassination records when we began our work. We worked with about a dozen congressional committees or remnants, descendants of congressional committees that no longer existed. We worked with dozens of state and local agencies. Most of them were in Texas and Louisiana. We worked with all of the presidential libraries. I think we did work briefly, at least, with the Eisenhower Library even. And we listened to thousands of citizens who wrote letters or called or sent emails who had information to share. In the end, we made over 27,000 decisions on information to either postpone or open. Early on, we decided that this review was going to be word for word. If an agency said, this document cannot be opened, our response was, the document is going to be opened. Show us what words you want us to protect and tell us why. There were about 33,000 additional what we called consent releases. That meant that the agency had decided to release directly to the National Archives information that they had earlier requested us to postpone. I think, practically speaking, that was a fancy way of saying that the agency gave up, realizing that we would not postpone the information they were requesting. One aspect of this work that I think is particularly extraordinary is that there were no successful agency appeals at the White House. Not a single one. The FBI had a penchant for appealing our decisions early on. I think there were several hundred appeals. An appeal meant legal briefs, and it was a lot of work for us. They really had us tied down with preparing legal briefs for the White House. Some of those were resolved because we sat down and worked things out, but most of those appeals were resolved in our favor by our persistence in pushing. For example, we decided to open material. The FBI would say we can't open it because of some particular law enforcement related reason. Well, through good staff work, oftentimes we would find that document released and open in some other file. And fortunately, that the FBI would give up. Some agencies didn't give up when they heard that. The Secret Service, for example, when we proved to them that a set of records that they fought very hard over had been released about 15 years earlier in a file that was at the National Archives, their response was to try to take back the file from the National Archives. The fact that we had no successful appeals is a credit, I think, to President Clinton, who was very supportive of this act when we began. There was no congressional appropriation for us to start. So we got money out of the White House supplemental appropriations budget, which is essentially a slush fund for the White House in case things come up during the course of an appropriation cycle, and we got about, I think, $500,000 out of that fund so that we could start our work. There is close to 5 million pages, which is the collection in at the National Archives at College Park, created by the review board and all the documents that have gone over there. There's an index, not fully complete, that is on the web, and we completed a 240-page final report to the President. And as I said, many pieces of the puzzle were found, many are lost to history, and I think there are some yet to be discovered. The board's work, and I think this is important because people say, well, why didn't you get such and such a record? Why didn't you take that record? There's 4 principal areas in which we were at work, and I think it's very important to distinguish those. The first area was the guts of our work, and I think what Congress thought was going to be virtually our entire job, and that was the processing of the many thousands of records maintained by the federal agencies. Virtually all of them were released. Some information was redacted. But these were records that had already been designated through the years as assassination records. It was the heart of our work and really a massive undertaking, a lot of duplicates. These were segregated collections of records previously identified by investigators, and that took a lot of our time, particularly in the early year or two. The second category was the search for additional information and records at the federal agencies. We had a lot of power and authority in this area. These were records that were not identified by the agencies either because they did not know the record existed or because the record fell outside the board's expanded definition of assassination records. It may be that those were records that weren't requested by the HSCA, for example. A good part of Sam Giancana's organized crime file at the FBI was not turned over to the HSCA, and allegedly because it was not requested. That was the pre-assassination file. So that was a part of a file that we went after later that wasn't part of the original collections. Examples include not only organized crime files, but files on Vietnam and countless name searches of individuals whose names have been alleged to be attached in some way to the assassination. Those two areas were the two where we had the greatest amount of power and authority. We had subpoena power, albeit subpoena power that was tempered by a Justice Department that didn't want to let us use it very often, but we had the power in that area. The third area which we spent considerable time was the pursuit of records from private citizens and local governments. Here we had much more limited jurisdiction. We could use the subpoena if DOJ would permit us, if we could prove to them that the information sought would lead to the discovery of assassination records. But we could not compel records to be produced from private citizens. So we had to rely more on persuasion than anything else. Mr. Samolak, who's here, spent a lot of time on these records, traveling around the country, twisting arms and gently persuading people that it would be in the interests of history for them to share records that they had. And I think in the end we were remarkably successful in this area. It really was through outstanding staff work that was strongly supported by the board. We didn't get everything. As I mentioned earlier during my discussion today, we didn't get files from Admiral Berkeley, in part because he was dead, his attorney was dead. The law firm said, well, we'll give it to you if his family signs a waiver. The family would not even communicate with us. They wanted to stay as far away from us as we could, so we didn't get those files. Maybe they'll be out someday, and that would be real helpful. But we didn't have the authority to compel it. We couldn't sweep into a law firm, take a file, and put it in the government collection. And finally, the last area, we used our authority to attempt to clarify the federal record on some of the most confusing aspects of the assassination and its aftermath. We were a bit out on a limb on this area. We really didn't have the power to decide anything, but I did feel that we had just enough power to engage in actions which would help clarify the record, and no one challenged us. Not all of the board members felt that this was appropriate for us to do. I felt strongly that we should do it. I'm not sure I wasn't sure what we would accomplish at the time, but we worked in three areas. One, the medical evidence. We heard a day yesterday of presentations on the medical evidence, and the state of the record at the time of the assassination and through the years has been a mess. And we deposed the autopsy pathologists, we deposed Parkland physicians, we interviewed people. So there's a record that we created that's at the National Archives that hopefully will be helpful to researchers. We consulted closely with some of the noted researchers in the field for help in directing this activity. The Zapruder film is another area where we devoted significant time. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And we also ordered and supervised ballistics testing on the nose cone fragment found in the front of the limousine. We were a bit out on a limb on this authority, but I think it was a good idea to do it. We probably could have done it in other areas had we had the time. Now I want to raise some questions about the board's work that are frequently asked and answer those questions, and then I want to get into just a few of the areas that we spent time in and describe some of what we found. The question always is, did this basic process as set forth in the JFK Records Collection Act work? I think unquestionably the answer is yes. Massive numbers of documents previously completely sealed were pried from intelligence and law enforcement agencies and released very quickly. No outside group, other than, I suppose, the president, who can hardly be considered an outsider, ever had authority before it ordered declassification of records, and never had so many previously sealed records been released so fast to the public. The process works. It's targeted declassification Historians will argue till they're blue in the face that that's not a good way to release records. I tend to agree in some respect, but if you want to get a lot of records out quickly, this is the way to do it. What parts of the process were critical to making it work well? Our independence. None of us needed to please federal agencies or answer to the president or answer to a secretary of a cabinet agency. We all held jobs, so we weren't dependent for our next jobs on individuals in government, and we served part-time in these roles. It was hard, I think, on everyone personally to be flying back and forth to Washington and really taking on 2 full-time jobs at one time, the review board and our own jobs. But I think the part-time status worked because we weren't looking for our next jobs, and that was helpful. The structural independence and independent agency in the executive branch, we could not be removed from our positions except for a cause, and that's a very high standard. The broad presumption of openness guided our toughest decisions. If it's a real close call, that presumption was important for us. And the high standard that the agency had to show. And also we had the ability to use substitute language when we did redact information, and that was important to understanding the document. Instead of a blank hole in a line, we put substitute language in so people understood that we were redacting a CIA operation or something like that. Were any of the board's early decisions critical to its later success? I think without question we made the correct decision in expanding the definition of an assassination record. We had the power to do that in the statute, and it caused enormous grief among the agency people who had to go back and re-review material. They gathered together their records as the Act said that they should. We weren't appointed right away. They thought their work was done when they gathered together all these assassination records, and lo and behold, one of our first public meetings was gathering advice from people on how to define assassination record, and we defined it very broadly. Essentially, it was an assassination record if it could possibly be related in any way to the assassination, or if the board said it was an assassination record. And that was a pretty good definition. Our other most important early decision was that any postponements would be considered on a word-for-word basis and not on a document-by-document basis, and that meant that every document would be opened. There's always some corner of a document that there wasn't something written on that it could be opened. As we went about our work, we always insisted on attaching particular release dates to our postponements. We had the power to do so, but it wasn't early on considered as something we would do, and the board felt strongly about doing it. So every postponement has a release date. And most of those dates, I might add, except for the postponements that were extended to the end of the life of the statute in 2017, and there's a few of those, but most of the postponements had earlier release dates, and virtually all of those dates have passed. So if you get a document at the National Archives, you might see redacted material and a release date. That release date has probably already passed, which means you should go back to Steve Tilley and the staff and say, the whole record should be released because the date has passed. How important was the political climate in Washington at the time? Very important. As I told you, the FBI appealed a significant number of our decisions, and none were successful. The President supported our work. It was very clear and plain. A president who was willing to take the position of agency chiefs could easily have crippled our effort, and I mean really crippled our effort. What were the biggest problems with the way the board was set up? There were problems, and I think it's important to examine them as well. The most significant initial problem was that the law set up quick time limits for agencies to organize assassination records to be transmitted to the board. So they did. The first President Bush was supposed to make the appointments within 30 days of the passage of the act, but he ignored it, and all the recommendations sat in boxes that were shipped to Houston, and we lost about 6 months of time there as the recommendations had to be redone for President Clinton. So the agencies really had to start over with their work, and it cost, I think, agencies a lot more to do their review because of it. The largest problem, in my view, was the unreasonable time limit placed on the board, a 3-year sunset with an extra year at the board's discretion. We actually were almost approaching the sunset when we were just beginning our work, and therefore Congress passed an initial extension giving us the original full time. But then they also gave us the extra year that we requested. But to expect us to start a very new and very different federal agency from scratch, without office space or budget, and completely finish our work in 3 or 4 years was, at the most, was very difficult. Not per se unreasonable, and I think the job was doable in that time frame, but the placing of the time limit on us, I think, significantly impacted our ability to do the jobs. It did give agencies the ability to hold out on the board, knowing that they just delayed responding a little bit longer, they would not have to deal with the board. We tried a number of techniques to get around that. I think they were modestly successful. But an even bigger problem occurred, and that was the fact that it made our employees, the review board staff, temporary employees. And the knowledge that an employee would lose his or her job in a year or so caused us to lose very good employees who felt they could not turn down excellent job offers that came along in our last year. So our staff in our last year was not as strong as the staff in the second year. I'll be the first to admit that, and we ended with 16 staffers rather than the 30 that we had. No one wanted to turn this temporary agency into a permanent agency like so many in Washington, but the artificial deadline did impact us. A second restriction, which was made in good faith, was really inadvisable. That was a restriction on hiring anyone who was working for a federal agency. It resulted in a very slow startup because background and security checks took a long time. Everyone had to have top secret security clearance to look at these records, and that takes a while in Washington. It prevented us also from hiring people that could have helped us hit the ground running. It also prevented us from bringing in people on leaves of absence from agencies who could have worked without the worry of not having a job at the end. The most cumbersome part of the process was the requirement of referrals for third-party equities. If this is a real headache, let me tell you. When classified information from one agency appears in the document of another agency, the document must be referred to the other agency for their decision on whether to make redactions. And if you have 3 or 4 agencies represented in one document, it is a major nightmare to get that document back and forth when, after all, it is a classified record. It can't just be dropped in the mail and sent over to the other agency. We finally started convening multi-agency declassification sessions in an attempt to get around the problem. How are you sure that you received full cooperation from the agencies? I'm not sure that we did. I hope so, and I don't have any evidence to suggest that agencies deliberately withheld from us relevant documents that they were holding in their hands. We did make agencies sign under oath and penalty of perjury that they had released to us all known records, so someone could be prosecuted if it turns out that they did not. We also deposed certain agency representatives in the agencies that we had the most trouble with, so that we had that under oath as well. That's about all we could do, and I hope that that was enough. What happened to the law when the review board ended its work? Well, the law is still there, and I think we're going to talk a little bit about that subject when we get into the group session here afterwards. Let me just give you a little bit of a flavor for what we did. With the agencies, 8 directors all pledged full cooperation, but at the operational level, at first, this was nothing short of a war. This is something entirely new. We met the keepers of the secrets at the CIA. We met operational people who would be brought in to tell us, well, you can't release that information because it's going to jeopardize a very significant criminal investigation that's going on worldwide right now. And silence as we waited for further explanation of what this important criminal operation was. And the people would say, "We can't tell you. We can't compromise an investigation like that." Our response was, "Well, if you don't tell us, this document is going to be ordered released by the end of the day, today." And they'd look at the lawyers and have this look on their face which suggested they were saying, "Can they do that?" And to watch the lawyers shrink back and nod their head tentatively was quite a sight. Eventually, I think we achieved a pretty good relationship with the agencies, but we met some very interesting characters along the way. The keepers of the secrets. The FBI fought us legally with the President, and fortunately the President and then White House counsel, Judge Mikva, were very supportive of us, and they put down those brush fires. Abraham Zapruder's film, I have to talk just a minute about that. We engaged in an incredible dance with the Zapruder family over the 4 years of our existence. I tried mightily to convince that family to donate to the public the camera original film. We worked closely with them. We brought in experts from Kodak, including the original inventor of the camera that had been used by Abraham Zapruder. We helped them digitalize the film so that there is a digitalized version that will be kept forever now. It's computerized. We got some good use out of it, but we helped the family there. So we did work on authenticating the original film. It was deemed to be the original film. It was authenticated as the original from the camera. But we couldn't quite get the family to agree to turn over the original. So in the end, after a public hearing and careful consideration, we took the original from the family, and I mean taking in the constitutional sense, to which they were justified in claiming compensation. The Justice Department handled that compensation case for us. The Zapruder family brought in expensive big-name lawyers. The Justice Department handled it and decided that they wanted to go to arbitration and not let it go to the Court of Claims because their record in the Court of Claims, they said, was so bad. So we went to arbitration, and this all happened, the arbitration actually happened after the board was done. And the Zapruder family, of course, brought in evidence of all the Kennedy memorabilia that had been sold over the years and how much Arnold Schwarzenegger paid for Kennedy's golf clubs, and this whole list of all this interesting material. And unfortunately, two of the three arbitrators, one of whom was a retired federal judge, two of these three agreed that the camera original film, without giving up the rights to it, the right to sell its use, was worth $16 million. There was a dissenter who adopted our view, which was that the film was probably worth about $750,000 at most. And I really found that decision to be outrageous. I have to say that. $16 million was more than twice what the entire review board effort cost for our entire 4 years of operation, and we never anticipated that that would be the cost of the film. But the original is there at the National Archives. It cannot be taken anywhere by anyone anymore. It will be preserved. It's in as perfect conditions for saving it as possible. And it's there for future generations, and we felt that was important because there have been so many allegations made about alterations made to the film. The KGB files in Minsk and Moscow, we worked very hard. This was one of our areas where we were not very successful in getting records. The Act told us that we should use the Department of State to help us gain access to foreign records. We didn't get much help from the Department of State, but we went to work on the subject anyway. In Minsk, they have the Oswald surveillance file, and it stands about 5 feet tall if you put all the files on top of each other. I've seen a lot of it. I've had it explained to me. I've had it shown to me. Norman Mailer got access to probably about 300 or so pages of that file. ABC television got access to the file very early on. Every time we came close to getting it, some new diplomatic problem erupted with the government of Belarus, which has a dictator, an authoritarian leader, and we never got it. Eventually, I think that file will be made available, and it's essentially everything Lee Harvey Oswald did for 2.5 years that he was in the Soviet Union. And it's remarkable. I mean, they gave him a wonderful apartment to live in when he defected, and they finally let him stay. It was in Minsk, far away from Moscow, where he couldn't cause harm in their view. And the apartment was a nice, big one-room apartment right by the river in Minsk, and it had a peephole in the ceiling, and women were employed to watch everything that went on in there, and their record of everything that went on is written in this file. In addition, everything that Oswald said to his co-workers was reported to KGB handlers at the end of the day. And for those who want to learn more about this man, and people want to know more about Oswald, he was 24 years old when he died. He's obviously a central figure in the assassination, and people want to know more about him, and these files would be very helpful. The KGB also has assassination files. They have the record of the KGB's investigation into the assassination, which they conducted because the Kremlin was fearful that the Americans were going to blame the assassination on them when they heard that Oswald had been arrested, and 44 hours later Oswald was killed. The Soviets were smart enough to smell that something was amiss here, and they knew everything about Oswald because even the Kremlin leaders had been receiving reports on Oswald when he was in the Soviet Union. So there is a huge file there. The problem is it details all of the Soviet Union's operational spying activity on the United States in the 1960s. Are we going to get it anytime soon? Maybe not, but I think we need to use our leverage whenever we have it to try to get access to these files. Vice President Gore pled our case with Victor Chernomyrdin at his meetings with him. It was very helpful. The National Security Council refused to allow the subject to come up in the September 1998 summit meeting between President Clinton and President Yeltsin. Later on, Yeltsin did turn over about 100 pages of material, largely foreign ministry material, and I don't think much of great interest to us. So there's a file there that is waiting to be released at some point in time. We also went after files in Cuba, although they were very cooperative, and I think President Castro enjoyed reading the files that we had released on the efforts undergone in the 60s to kill him. And they were quite cooperative in return, wanting even to meet with us, although we were not able to arrange that. But they don't have much in writing. Their answer was that, well, in the early years of the revolution, we didn't write down very much. So I mentioned the medical records. We did spend a lot of time on the medical records and trying to clarify them. And I hope that we succeeded in some respect to clarify them. There's so many other areas I could talk about. The Oswald in Mexico City situation. Obviously, as I mentioned earlier, we released the Lopez Hardaway report, a couple hundred pages. It's a fascinating report on the CIA's investigation into Oswald in Mexico City. Very little of that is protected at this point in time. But we also searched for the elusive audio tapes. The audio tapes that the CIA said were destroyed within days of their recording. And then records turned up later to suggest that perhaps they did exist, at least in December of 1963. We looked long and hard for them. We didn't find them. We went to Mexico to look for them. We looked everywhere. I'm still not convinced that they do not exist, and hopefully that search will continue. Oswald records everywhere. We looked for records on Oswald everywhere. The INS records, CIA records, FBI, the military records, the Office of Naval Intelligence, a lot of records on Oswald, and there's so much there now, and virtually all of that has been released. We didn't protect anything on central core files about Oswald. I think I'm running close to my end time here. I'll mention a few more things, and then I'm sure Ben will tell me when I need to wrap up, and I'll then wrap up in a minute or so. The FBI organized crime files are fascinating, and we released all relevant FBI crime files of that era. Not because it's proven that Sam Giancana had something to do with the assassination, but the name has been mentioned a time or two, and he, after all, was involved in Operation Mongoose, and he's a very interesting figure, murdered before he was going to testify before the church committee. And so the files show a fascinating story of these mafia chiefs involved in anti-Castro activities, their constant complaints at the same time that they were serving their country in that respect. They were being harassed by the FBI. There are 37 volumes of Giancana files that are now open. The Brylab electronic surveillance files on Carlos Marcello in New Orleans are all open. Frank Regano's materials on Santos Trafficante, in which he claims that Trafficante confessed to ordering the assassination on his deathbed, all of that is available and interesting and stuff that you should look at if you're interested in organized crime. We looked for Hoover's files. Where are those secret and confidential files of J. Edgar Hoover? We found some. Some existed still. There were copies in other files. Most of them, I'm convinced, were destroyed within an hour or two of his death by his longtime secretary, Helen Gandy. I think that's true. When John Moore, who was also present at that time, died, we subpoenaed his family to turn over any records that he might have. He didn't have much that he had brought home. So we tried on Hoover and released everything that we could find. James Angleton is a figure that deserves special mention. Probably one of the most extensive lawbreakers ever to work for our federal government, the longtime CIA chief of counterintelligence. If you've read anything about him, it's really downright scary. Unfortunately, Angleton took over the CIA's investigation into the assassination several weeks after the assassination. When you ask the CIA for records on Angleton, the answer you receive is this, that those records are no longer identifiable as a collection. Now, what I think that means in CIA speak is that they were destroyed, likely by Angleton, right before his unceremonious departure from the CIA after he was outed by the church committee. Unfortunately, Angleton performed another service that when Win Scott died in 1973, Scott was a pack rat who was the head of the Mexico City station during 1963. Angleton knew that, so Angleton volunteered to go sit down with Win Scott's widow and go over his material, which he did, and he took material, and of course none of that has ever been seen again as well. And if you read Ben Bradley's autobiography, you'll see an interesting chapter on Angleton mysteriously showing up at one point in his life as well. One last item, the CIA's family jewels memoranda. We were after these early, and we kept getting rebuffed by the CIA. These were memoranda which are they're called the family jewels because they were done for Jim Schlesinger, the director in the 70s. They were detailing action taken outside of the agency's mandate, which means he wanted to know everything there was to know about the bad things the CIA had done, because he was about to testify before the church committee. Well, we finally got that about a week remaining in our existence. 693 pages long, extensive material. We designated parts of 27 pages as related to the assassination, so we finally got into that. A lot of other areas that I could mention. I just want to wrap up by saying we didn't find anything that I consider to be a smoking gun, at least not to the degree of certainty that Americans want. All mysteries concerning the assassination are probably not going to be solved, but I think there are still mysteries that are ready to be solved. I'm glad we operated this board in a manner so that we didn't tell you what happened, but we released the material to you so you can tell us what happened, because I think that's the way this process should work. And I will tell you that the files are an extraordinary window on the 1960s. We got into Vietnam, Cuba, everything that could possibly have been related to the Kennedy assassination, and it is fascinating, the amount of material that's now open for researchers. And I think we also proved, most importantly to intelligence agencies, that we could release secrets and the Republic will survive. And for all of you who are interested, there's a treasure trove of fresh, new, open files for the researchers and the public. And hopefully, if you have the time to go by College Park to see the collection, you'll have a chance to use it. And hopefully it'll be a collection that will be added to in the years to come. Thank you very much.